Senator JD Vance tried to corner Jasmine Crockett with a cheap political shot. What he got instead was a brutal, honest truth he wasn't ready for. The hearing room wasn't loud, but it wasn't quiet either, the kind of murmur that rises when cameras are rolling and every word might turn into tomorrow's headline. Federal housing reform was the agenda, but for a lot of the folks in the room, this wasn't about housing. It was about territory, about power. And when Representative Jasmine Crockett adjusted her mic and leaned forward, she knew exactly what kind of room she was in. Across from her sat Senator JD Vance, hair neatly parted, tie slightly loosened but intentional. He had that confident, lean politicians get when they think they're the smartest one in the room. Vance didn't say anything yet, but he was watching her like he was waiting for an opening. Crockett didn't give it to him. Not yet. She'd come prepared, binder full of data, yes. But more than that. Stories, names, faces, the people who would never be invited to this table. She'd flown in from Dallas the night before, reviewed policy briefs on the plane, skipped the staff dinner. None of that mattered now. It was time. Representative Barry Granger from Oregon was speaking when Vance started shifting in his chair. Prepping. Granger was rambling about modular housing and innovation grants, but it was clear. This wasn't what Vance came for. His eyes kept flicking to Crockett. And finally, when Granger finished, he raised his hand for recognition. "Madam Chair," he said smoothly, "I'd like to direct a question to Representative Crockett." And just like that, the attention shifted. The cameras tilted. Some staffers turned their heads. Vance kept his tone measured. "You've spoken in favor of increasing federal housing funds to address conditions in cities like Dallas," he began. "But how do you justify that when so many of those cities are plagued by violence, mismanagement, and chronic homelessness under your leadership? Wouldn't more federal money just prop up failure?" There it was. The words weren't loud, but they were sharp, designed to sting, designed to say, your people can't run anything, designed to frame cities, black and brown communities, as broken as drains. And he knew exactly what he was doing. For a split second, Crockett didn't move. She didn't blink. Then she reached for her water, took a small sip, and placed the bottle back down. She didn't smile. She didn't raise her voice. But her hand hovered over the binder, and her tone stayed steady. "Senator," she said, "I'm glad you asked." Some folks in the back looked up. There was something in her voice, low and even, that didn't match the attack. But it held weight. Like she'd been waiting for this question all her life. "I represent a district where people work double shifts and still can't afford rent, where schools share roofs with mold and rats, where families are living two to a room, not because they want to, but because they have no choice. You say mismanagement. I say disinvestment." She paused, but not for drama. For effect. "The violence you speak of, it didn't appear out of thin air. It came from a system that built highways through our neighborhoods, redlined us out of opportunity, and then acted surprised when the consequences showed up." Her voice didn't rise, but her words hit the air like bricks. "And since you brought up federal money, Dallas sends billions to the federal government every year. Our people pay taxes. We're not asking for handouts. We're demanding our fair share. You want accountability? Let's talk about where the money does go." Vance shifted slightly. Just a breath, not enough to call it discomfort, but noticeable. Crockett could see it. She wasn't done. But this wasn't the moment she flipped the script. That was coming next. Senator Vance gave a short chuckle, dry. Just enough to show he wasn't rattled, but his fingers tapped once against the table. He leaned in, ready to swing again. "Well, Representative," he said, still keeping that polished tone. "You mentioned redlining and highways, but we're in 2025. At what point do the leaders in those cities take responsibility for what's happening now? Or are we still blaming the past instead of fixing the present? Some people in the room shifted in their seats, not out of shock. This wasn't new, it was familiar. A politician asking for accountability, but only in one direction. The kind of line that gets applause in a friendly room and quiet nods in others. But this wasn't one of those rooms, and Crockett wasn't one of those representatives. She didn't flinch. "You want responsibility?" she asked. "Let's have that conversation." She opened her binder and pulled out a single sheet. The font was small, highlighted. She held it up, not for show, but so it was clear she wasn't just talking. She came with proof. "Here's a federal report from 2023. It shows that the states with the highest poverty rates are overwhelmingly rural. It shows that access to clean water, healthcare, and safe housing isn't just an urban issue. It's hitting Appalachia, the Mississippi Delta, places like Ross County, Ohio." She looked directly at him now. "That's your state, right?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. "You want to talk about leadership? Let's talk about that, because while you're questioning urban leaders, your own constituents are living in trailer homes with black mold and no access to running water. Some of them don't even have consistent power, and you voted against the bill that would have helped them." A few people near the back raised eyebrows. One staffer scribbled something quickly on a legal pad. Vance adjusted his mic. "With all due respect," he started, "those problems are complex. We can't solve rural poverty with a single bill, and neither can we solve housing insecurity in cities with just one grant program." Crockett cut in. "Confirm. But when you question the competence of leaders based on the zip code they serve, especially when those zip codes are filled with people of color, you're not offering solutions. You're dodging your own record." There it was. She didn't shout, didn't have to. The weight came from how quiet her voice remained. Across the room, a few younger aides leaned forward, trying to catch every word. On Twitter, a live thread had already picked up steam. Someone had clipped the last 30 seconds and posted it with the caption, "Crockett didn't come to play." But this wasn't about Twitter, this was about people. People like Ms. Leona in South Dallas, who'd called Crockett's office every week for 3 months trying to get her Section 8 housing paperwork approved. People like Carlos, a high school junior living out of his aunt's van while finishing his exams. People who don't get hearings, who don't get microphones, but who live the consequences of policies written in rooms just like this. Crockett reached into her folder again. This time she pulled out a photo. It wasn't dramatic, just a 2-story house in bad shape. Peeling paint, roof sagging, a blue tarp held down by bricks. She slid it forward so it was visible to the camera. "This is in Chillicothe, Ohio, not Dallas. A woman named Terry lives here. She's 61. Her heater broke 2 winters ago. She uses her oven for heat. And you know what she told a reporter last month? They always talk about big cities on the news. Nobody ever asks about us." Crockett looked at Vance again, but this time her voice dropped just slightly. "People like Terry and people like Ms. Leona, they're not each other's enemy. But when you use hearings like this to play city versus country politics, that's what you create." She leaned back in her chair. "I'm not here to perform, I'm here to work." But the moment that changed everything, that was still coming. For a second, JD Vance said nothing. He shifted slightly in his chair again, just enough to suggest discomfort but not enough to admit it. A few rows back, someone coughed. Crockett didn't move. She let the silence sit, let the weight of her words stay in the air longer than most politicians are comfortable with. Then she leaned in. "I'm not going to pretend like cities don't have problems," she said, her voice level, almost casual. "We do. But let me make something clear. Poverty is not a moral failure. It's not a symptom of laziness or bad leadership. It's a result of policy. It's a result of decisions made by people who've never had to live with the consequences." She opened her folder again, neatly organized, tabbed, color-coded. I brought data since people love data when it comes from think tanks. She continued tapping the pages. Let's talk about eviction rates. Dallas has one of the highest in the country, sure. But it's not because people don't want to pay. It's because wages haven't kept up with rent. The median rent in my district is $1,150. The average person working full-time at minimum wage makes about $200 a month. Do the math. A murmur started in the back. Not applause, just acknowledgement. People process, check numbers in their heads. The tone of the room began to shift. Not in her favor, not against Vance, but toward the reality she was painting. And let's not forget, she added, those same families still get their utilities cut off when they fall behind. Their kids still get sick from mold. And when they apply for relief, they get waitlisted or denied because the federal money's already gone, diverted somewhere else. Somewhere that looks nothing like them. She let that sit for just a beat. I know what this looks like, Crockett went on. I've seen it. I've lived pieces of it. My mother cleaned houses during the day and stocked shelves at night. She didn't ask for pity. She asked for a roof that didn't leak and a doctor who'd see her without a 6-week wait. Her voice was steady, but it carried more now. She wasn't reading anymore. She was remembering. I went to a public high school that failed its accreditation twice. You know what our government said? We'll revisit this funding in 2 years. 2 years? That's someone's freshman and sophomore year gone. Try explaining that to a parent whose kid is already falling behind. Vance looked down at his notes. Crockett noticed. She kept going. This hearing isn't about blame, she said. It's about willpower. It's about whether we want to fix things or just win arguments. Because I can tell you, people in my district aren't checking C-SPAN to see who scored points. They're checking to see if their housing voucher went through. Senator Pauline Marks, sitting 3 chairs down, scribbled something in the margins of her notebook. She didn't look up. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room felt the energy shifting. And Crockett? She wasn't even close to finishing. But since we're talking responsibility, she said, flipping a page, let's not pretend like urban districts caused their own collapse. Have you ever heard of the urban renewal programs of the 1950s and 60s? That was federal policy. Bulldozed whole communities, ran highways through black neighborhoods, relocated families with no plan, no support, and called it progress. What followed? Generational housing instability. She leaned forward again, voice even quieter now, the kind of tone that forces people to lean in. We didn't ask for the knife, but we've been bleeding ever since. You could hear it then, the quiet of a room caught between reflection and tension. Crockett wasn't attacking. She was testifying. Vance, for once, didn't interrupt. But what Crockett said next would put him directly on the defensive. Representative Crockett closed her binder for the first time. Since she'd started speaking, she didn't need it anymore. What came next wasn't from policy briefings or research papers. It came from experience and precision. You know what gets me, Senator? She asked, her eyes locked on him. It's this narrative that poverty only looks like tall buildings, cracked sidewalks, and graffiti-covered walls. That when you see black and brown people struggling, it's poor leadership. But when it's white families in rural areas, it's a national crisis. You don't hear people saying they failed. You hear them saying the system failed. She let that sit, just long enough to sting. I've spent time in places like Athens County and Jackson Township, she continued, naming parts of Ohio most of the room probably hadn't even heard of. Not for press, not for optics, but because the poor are poor, whether it's in East Dallas or a trailer park outside Zanesville, you say urban leaders need to step up. But what about rural representation? What about your job? The words were like a slow burn, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, inescapable. Vance inhaled sharply through his nose and adjusted his seat again. With all due respect, but she didn't stop. No. Let's actually talk about respect, she said. Because I'm tired of people showing up to these hearings to take cheap shots at mayors and community organizers and single moms, and then turning around and voting against the same bills that could help people in your counties. She shifted forward in her seat, one hand gripping the mic. I read through your voting record last night. You opposed the Rural Housing Stability Assistance Program. That would have funded rehabs for low-income rentals, assisted homeless veterans in small towns, and supported transitional housing for families evicted during the pandemic. You voted no. Now she was looking straight at him. You talk about how the American dream is slipping away from the heartland, but when your constituents need help paying heating bills, you blame bureaucracy. When they overdose in a gas station parking lot, you blame culture. And when someone tries to fund solutions, you call it government overreach. A few quiet gasps fluttered across the room. And I want to be real clear, she said. I'm not weaponizing their pain. I'm acknowledging it. Because the truth is, those folks deserve better too. But if we're going to sit here and act like one version of poverty is a political liability and the other is a call to action, then we're not serious about change. We're just rehearsing bias. Vance reached for his pen, didn't write anything, then set it down again. He looked toward the chairwoman as if waiting for a lifeline. None came. Crockett wasn't finished. I once met a man in Jackson, Ohio. Name was Ronnie. I am 71 years old, former steel worker. Lost his pension when the company folded. Lives on peanut, butter, canned beans, and whatever's left of his Social Security check. He told me he's too proud to ask for help and too tired to fight for it. But he was really clear about one thing. He didn't care what party fixed things. He just wanted to not wake up cold in February. She paused. Ronnie's story isn't that different from a lot of people I know back home. Except we talk about folks like Ronnie with sympathy, and we talk about folks like mine with suspicion. The hearing room was no longer tense. It was frozen. She leaned back and folded her hands. If we're going to build housing policy that works, she said quietly, we have to stop playing categories. Rural versus urban, white versus black, worthy versus dependent, because those aren't real divisions, they're political distractions. The chairwoman didn't interrupt. No one did. But Crockett wasn't finished yet, because now she was about to make it personal. Representative Crockett looked down for a moment, not at her binder, not at any notes, just gathering breath. When she raised her head, again the tone shifted. You could feel it. She wasn't debating anymore. She was remembering. I don't usually talk about this in hearings, she began, because the second you get personal, folks either dismiss you or try to use it against you. But today, I'm going to tell you something. She leaned slightly closer to the mic. I was 13 when we got evicted. My mother worked 6 days a week. My dad had just gotten laid off from the auto shop. One morning we came home from school and our stuff was on the lawn. Couch, boxes, our TV, everything. Just out there like it didn't matter. My little brother thought we were moving. He didn't understand what was happening. The room had gone quiet. Not polite silence, real, heavy silence. Even Senator Vance kept his eyes on her now. We stayed with my aunt for 2 weeks, then a neighbor for 3. It was the first time I realized how fragile stability is. You think you're okay until you're not. You think your hard work guarantees you safety until the notice is on your door. She took a breath. We eventually got into a small apartment. My mother never let us call it the bad side of town. She said, it's not bad. It's just ours for now. A staffer across the room put her pen down slowly. Years later, Crockett continued, I became a public defender. One of my first clients was a woman who'd been arrested for trespassing. Except she wasn't trespassing. She was living in an abandoned house with her 2 kids. She cleaned office buildings at night and dropped them off at school in the morning, but technically she had no address, so she was a criminal. She paused, not for drama, but because her throat caught for a second. I remember sitting across from her and thinking, if one thing had gone differently for me, I could have been her. Same grit, same exhaustion, same fire in her eyes. No one in the room looked away. This is why I fight the way I do. This is why I show up with data and names. Because people don't live in charts, they live in neighborhoods. They live in motel rooms and bus shelters and cars that should have been junked 5 years ago. Senator Vance had gone still. His hands rested on his notes, unmoving. And look, I don't hate rural communities. I've driven through your counties. Senator, I've stopped at gas stations where the shelves were half empty. I've seen kids walking a mile down the road to catch a school bus. You think I don't recognize that pain? You think because I fight for urban housing I'm blind to that? She shook her head slowly. That's where we mess up, when we let these fake divisions keep us from seeing the truth. That poverty doesn't care what state you're in. It doesn't care who you voted for. It hits you just the same. Her voice softened, but her words stayed firm. My mom told me something. After that eviction, she said, don't ever let them shame you for what you had to survive. That stuck with me. Because every time someone tries to humiliate a poor family or turn them into a punchline for political gain, I hear her voice. She looked straight ahead again, not at Vance, not at the panel, but at the cameras. Every time someone calls public housing a failure, I see my brother sleeping on a couch in a borrowed living room. Every time someone says people should just work harder, I think about how my mom got blisters on her feet, scrubbing floors at 3 a.m. She straightened her shoulders. This isn't abstract for me. This is my story, and it's the story of millions of others who can't afford to be in this room. So if you're going to question their worthiness, you'd better be ready for someone to speak up. But while that hearing room was quiet, the outside world was already catching fire. By the time the hearing ended, the clip had already hit 3 million views. It started as a 47-second video posted by a junior staffer on their personal account. Just Crockett's final few lines about eviction, shame, and worthiness. No flashy edits, no music, just her voice, her face, and the silence of the room around her. That silence spoke louder than most campaigns ever could. An hour later, someone from a digital outlet in Columbus reposted it with the caption, JD Vance came for Jasmine Crockett. He wasn't ready. From there, it spread like dry grass catching flame. On TikTok, younger users stitched themselves into the clip, nodding slowly as she spoke, mouths tight, eyes glassy. Others told stories of eviction, of sleeping on couches, of hiding behind curtains during police knock and lock sweeps. They weren't engaging in political debate, they were remembering. On Twitter, hashtags like Crockett Clapback and the hashtag she said started trending within 2 hours. An Ohio-based housing nonprofit shared the video, adding, "We've been waiting for someone to say this out loud for years." By the time the evening news rolled in, major anchors were quoting parts of her speech. Not one network ignored it. Some called it a takedown. Others called it a reckoning. And although every outlet had its own spin, one fact stayed the same. Crockett had shifted the room and the conversation. Meanwhile, Vance's team was working behind the scenes to release a statement. It dropped on his official site just before midnight. We must all strive to improve the lives of those we serve, urban, rural, and everything in between. While I may disagree with Rappel Crockett's methods, I respect her passion. It was generic, safe, the kind of message that neither offends nor admits fault. But it didn't land. Comments under his post were filled with screenshots of Crockett's quotes. People pointed out her statistics, her personal stories. One user wrote, "She came with facts, he came with talking points." And in Dallas, Crockett's office phone didn't stop ringing. People called just to say thank you. One woman left a voicemail through tears saying, "I never thought anyone in Congress knew what it felt like to lose your home." But it wasn't just urban residents responding. That's what surprised everyone. Messages poured in from Chillicothe, Circleville, Portsmouth. Towns Vance had carried it easily during his last campaign. One message from a veteran in rural Ohio read, "I don't agree with her politics, but everything she said about housing out here was true. We've been forgotten." Crockett sat with her staff in a narrow office back in Dallas 2 days later. The walls were lined with printouts and handwritten letters. Some were from teenage students. One was from a retired pastor who'd never voted Democrat, but said he'd changed his mind. Still, she didn't smile about it. "This isn't a win," she told them. "It's a reminder." Her staffer, Devin, looked up. "A reminder of what?" "That we shouldn't need a viral video for people to believe our stories," she said. "People should have cared when Ms. Leona called my office 6 months ago. They should have cared when Ronnie's pension disappeared. The cameras weren't there for that. Someone in the back asked if they should start writing thank you responses to the letters. We will," she said. "But we're also going to finish drafting that new housing bill. One with teeth this time." The room quieted. Outside that office, political commentators were still dissecting every frame. Analysts speculated about Crockett's future. Some wondered if she'd run statewide. Others said she was too raw, too direct for the Senate. But her focus stayed the same. There was still work to do. But the deeper lesson behind all of this? That would come next, and it was about far more than politics. By the following week, the hype had started to fade. The headlines moved on, as they always do. A tech company went under. A senator said something off-color on a podcast. But for the people who really listened to what Crockett had said, the moment hadn't passed, it had stuck, quietly, stubbornly, in the back of their minds. Because this wasn't just about a clapback, it wasn't about a polished moment on the Hill. What happened in that hearing tapped into something deeper. Something most people feel, but rarely say out loud. That the fight over housing isn't just a budget issue. It's a mirror. It forces people to confront what and who they think is worth saving. It's easy to sit behind microphones and throw statistics back and forth. Easy to say, personal responsibility, or pull yourself up when the conversation is abstract. But what Crockett did that day was make it personal. Not just with her story, but with everyone's. Because when you strip away the noise, what she said boiled down to one hard truth. This country doesn't treat all suffering the same. A working class, white man in rural Ohio is called forgotten. A working class black woman in South Dallas is called a failure. One is pitied, the other is blamed. That's not policy. That's biased. And that bias bleeds into every funding decision, every zoning law, every headline about who deserves help and who wasted it. Crockett's message wasn't that urban struggle deserves more sympathy than rural. It was that both deserve attention, both deserve investment, and neither should be weaponized against the other for political gain. But she also exposed something people rarely admit, that a lot of lawmakers depend on these divisions. Because if the poor in rural Ohio start seeing themselves in the poor in South Dallas, the whole game changes. Suddenly, the questions get harder. Suddenly, the people at the bottom start asking the same things and demanding real answers. And when that happens, someone's grip on power loosens. This is why moments like that hearing matter. Not because they go viral, but because they pull back the curtain. They show who's willing to speak when it's inconvenient, who's ready to be uncomfortable, who's willing to put truth above optics. There's a scene where people don't talk about much that happened the day after the hearing. Crockett was flying home. She sat in a middle seat, row 27, between a teacher from Little Rock and a contractor from Pittsburgh. No one recognized her. The teacher was reading. The contractor was dozing. Somewhere over Missouri, the teacher turned to her and asked, "You live in D.C.?" Crockett smiled. "Sometimes. I work there." The woman nodded. "It's loud over there." Crockett replied, too loud sometimes, but I try to speak for folks who don't have the mic. The teacher studied her for a moment, then said, "Well, if you're fighting for people who can't afford first class, you're in the right row." They laughed softly. Nothing profound, nothing dramatic. But that moment meant more to Crockett than any headline, because that's who she was fighting for. Not just the people who could donate or vote, but the ones stuck in the economy, trying to keep their heads above water, wondering if anyone in DC even saw them. She wasn't perfect. She'd say so herself. But she wasn't afraid to tell the truth, and in a room full of performance, that was rare. That hearing, it didn't change the system overnight, but it reminded people loudly, publicly, that their stories mattered, that somebody saw them. And sometimes that's the start. But before we close, there's one thing Crockett wanted everyone watching to remember. A week after the hearing, Representative Crockett stood outside a small community center in Lancaster, Texas. No cameras, no press, just folding chairs, a few clipboards, and a room full of people waiting to ask questions about rent assistance, code enforcement, and the possibility of a new housing pilot program. A man in his late 60s, wearing a faded Dallas Cowboys jacket and work boots, raised his hand near the end. He didn't ask about legislation. He didn't ask about funding. He just said, "Do they listen when you talk like that up there?" Crockett didn't answer right away. She looked at the man, then glanced around the room at all the others who'd probably wondered the same thing. "Not always," she said. "But I don't speak so they'll feel comfortable. I speak so y'all don't feel invisible." And that's what it came down to. The hearing wasn't about shaming Senator Vance or going viral. That wasn't the win. The win was the moment people heard something familiar in a place they never expected to be represented. A congresswoman talking like someone who'd stood in their shoes, not pretending, not posturing, just telling the truth. People forget that politics isn't just about laws. It's about memory. It's about whose version of reality gets believed, whose pain is validated, whose resilience gets ignored. When Crockett told that story about eviction, or brought up Terry in Ohio and Ronnie with his space heater, she wasn't performing. She was putting lives on the record. She was saying, these people exist. Their conditions aren't accidents. Their poverty isn't a footnote. And whether you live in a brick apartment in South Dallas or a trailer off a dirt road outside Athens, your life should matter. Equally, fully, no exceptions. That message struck a nerve, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest, raw even. The kind of honesty that can't be softened with spin or buried in a press release. And the truth is, we need more of that. Not just in Congress, but in every place where decisions are made. More people who aren't afraid to say, hey, this system is broken. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. We also need to stop pretending. That working class pain is only legitimate when it fits into someone's narrative. There's no such thing as the right kind of struggle. Whether you grew up in a housing project or a rural hollow, you know what it means to do everything right and still come up short. And if you do,